Um, I co-edited 2 volumes about the Red Army faction, which are on the table over there. Uh, the they're big books, and there's no way I can cover everything in the books tonight. So I'm not even gonna try because it would we'd be here for a week. It would be, you'd all be very bored and very tired by the end of it. So instead, I'm basically just gonna tell you, and the books only take up to 1984 so far. We're gonna do a 3rd volume, which brings up to the end. So, but what I'm gonna do tonight is I'm gonna give you the history, kind of in narrative form, of the Red Army faction, and I'm also going to talk, filter into it a little bit about 2 other armed organizations which were active in West Germany at the time, to kind of give a contrast and give some more context. So, the Red Army faction was what we would call an urban guerrilla organization or an armed struggle organization, what the state refers to as a terrorist organization. It was active in West Germany in the 1970s and 80s. And like a lot of things that, on the left from the 1970s and 80s, its roots can be found in the 60s. So in this time of around the world of like revolt, revolution, protest, change. And, when I say that the Red Army faction was active in West Germany, the reason I say West Germany and not Germany is because for roughly half of the 20th century, the country of Germany was actually 2 countries, East Germany, West Germany. East Germany was allied to the Soviet Union, was a part of the Warsaw Pact, and it was hostile to West Germany, which was allied with the United States and a part of NATO. And a weird thing was, right in the middle of East Germany, you had the city of Berlin, which was cut in 2 by a wall, and the west half of Berlin, even though it was in the middle of East Germany, it was basically a part of West Germany. And it was also allied to NATO and the United States and everything. And there were international agreements. There was basically one highway that East Germany had to keep open to allow people to drive in and out of West Germany. And it was a surreal scene. You'd have, East Bloc military, lining the highway, and when you were in West Germany, it was a very intense scene. You'd have the Berlin Wall, you'd have East German soldiers guarding the Berlin Wall, and all of this kind of thing. And because of this intensity, because it was like a weird place to live, and because West Germany overall was really conservative, when this wave of revolt, like the 60s revolt, when it comes to West Germany, it really just comes to West Berlin at first. It's like West Berlin's like a couple of years ahead of the rest of the country, and when things are changing really quickly, if you're a couple of years ahead, it's like, it's a different world kind of thing. So West Berlin was really the place to be in the 60s. You had developing a counterculture scene kind of built around, sex and drugs and music and communes beginning to be formed, young people experimenting with different ways of living. And then you also had a small student movement, which, started taking to the streets, protesting things like the war in Vietnam, protesting when foreign dignitaries who were involved in bad stuff would visit West Berlin. In one kind of watershed moment in 1967, the Shah of Iran was at the time like an American ally, so the Shah, the king of Iran, visits West Berlin. There's a demonstration against him, and this kid who was at his first demonstration gets shot through the head by an undercover police officer. People just freak out. It's a very small student movement. It's a very small radical left. People feel they're under siege. They feel that they're up against, their parents' generation or their grandparents' generation who were like Nazis kind of thing. They really feel, it's a do or die kind of situation. And, that's the demonstration that gets attacked in the most brutal way, but demonstrations in general are often being attacked by police. So some people start going to demonstrations with the idea, prepared to be attacked, and then some people start going to demonstrations with the idea that, they're prepared to fight back. So they bring things, they bring, Molotov cocktails to demonstrations, and then some of those people figure, well, why just go to a demonstration with a Molotov cocktail? Why not go out in the middle of the night when there's no cops around and do something with a Molotov cocktail? So you have really quickly in the late 60s, you have a development and escalation of political violence kind of thing. And you have this occurring in a very natural kind of way, without anybody putting out a rule book or saying we have to do this, just based on people's personal experiences. At the same time, on the edge of this countercultural scene, on the edge of the student movement, there's some people who, you know, they know all of the people in the communes, and, you know, but they kind of have a self-perception that they're more serious, maybe they think they're a bit smarter, or whatever kind of thing. And they also have an idea that this political violence thing, that's good, they think, but they also think it's too important just to let it develop on its own kind of thing. They feel it actually needs to be consciously pushed forward by people like them. So the form this takes in 1968 is 4 people traveled from West Berlin to Frankfurt, which is in West Germany, and they plant firebombs with timing devices in 2 department stores, timed to go off after the stores close. And they do go off after the stores close, and, you know, basically create these big fires. There's a tremendous amount of damage. But even though they thought they were, you know, maybe smarter and more serious than the others, you know, their security obviously wasn't great, because the cops, you know, knew who'd done it almost right away, and they were arrested the next day. And
Why did they pick the stores?
Well, in their trial, they said that they firebombed these stores. You know, they were just random department stores kind of thing. There was nothing special about them, but they said they did it as attacks in solidarity with the people in Vietnam, and in the context of the Vietnam War. And even though the stores themselves weren't involved, you know, in the Vietnam War, I think there was a sense that West Germany was complicit in US war crimes in Vietnam, so any kind of attack against anything in West Germany could be explained that way. But it was, you know, it was a confused kind of action, and they kind of acknowledged that in their trial, while saying that it was a political action. They kind of acknowledged that, yeah, people hadn't really understood, it wasn't super well thought out. They're kept in jail during their trial, so for a year they're in jail while they're on trial, and they're found guilty, which is kind of obvious they were going to be found guilty. But then at the end of their trial, their lawyer appeals, and the court decides to let them out pending the appeal. So suddenly they're out again, and 3 of the 4 people decide they're not going back to jail. Because it's kind of obvious their appeal's got to be turned down, but they're like, we're not going back to jail. And these 3 were this guy Thorwald Prohl, and this woman Gudrun Ensslin, and her boyfriend, this guy Andreas Bader. And their appeal is turned down, and Prohl kind of changes his mind, he turns himself in, but Ensslin and Bader don't, so they're suddenly living underground, which, you know, what that means at that time for them, you know, in a world without internet, without ATMs, without security cameras everywhere, it's just that they're avoiding the police, and they are, you know, staying at various people's houses, not doing anything in their own name, and, you know, trying to avoid being arrested. And it's fairly easy for them to do this, evidently, because they spend the next year basically, you know, couch surfing, staying at various people's homes. They travel in and out of the country. They go to France, they go to Italy, and really what they do for this year is they're talking to people. They're talking to people about how, like, we got to fight against the government, and we need to build a guerrilla group. We need to, you know, be able to resist in an armed kind of way. But it's largely, you know, it's largely just talk. And lots of people find it really interesting, these various people who let them sleep on their couch or who lend them a bed for a night. But, you know, it's unclear what would have happened, except that in 1970, an undercover police officer in West Berlin spots Andreas Bader and sets him up to be arrested. And he is arrested, and suddenly this kind of amorphous scene, which had been talking a lot, they're at a crossroads, because, you know, this guy who was saying all of this stuff is now in prison. So the question is, you know, do we just let that happen, or do we try and do something about it? And evidently some of them figured, well, actually, you know, it wasn't just talk, they want to do something about this. So the form this takes is one of the people who'd let them stay at her house, what happened to be probably the best-known left-wing female intellectual in West Germany at the time. She was a journalist, she was on TV regularly, her name was Ulrike Meinhof. And she writes a letter to the prison where Bob is being held, and she says, "Hi, it's Ulrika Meinhof. I'm a journalist. I'm doing this book, and also this film about kids in reform school," which was true. She was. And she also says one of your prisoners, Andreas Bader, before he was in prison, before he went underground and all of this stuff, he was doing political work with kids in reform school, which was also true. So she says, "I'd like to interview him as part of my research." And she asks, and the prison agrees. And so the form this takes is that Bader is brought under armed guard to this Library of Social Sciences in West Berlin. Meinhof shows up. They sit down together, they open the books, they pretend to be, discussing, her research and everything. And then 4 other people show up, and these 4 people have ski masks on and they have guns. This old man who worked at the library tries to push them away, and one of them raises a gun and shoots him in the stomach. And he doesn't die, but he's badly hurt. So suddenly the guards take out their guns, people are punching the guards, then people are jumping out a window. There's a woman waiting in a car outside. They jump into the car, and miraculously they all get away, and none of them are hurt.
Jesus.
Yeah. Well, it was
Everyone was doing
it was 1970. Not everyone was doing it, but like there was a degree of unpreparedness on the part of the state, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And it wasn't that everyone was doing it, because like when we were researching our first volume, we found the fact that they managed to do this made the newspapers, like, we're in Canada, all of these Canadian newspapers had articles, in the States, all of these newspapers had articles, so, even though it wasn't a prison break, it was like a library break kind of thing, it caught people's attention. And the various reporters writing about this, they only knew about this guy, Andreas Bader, who'd been broken out of prison, and this journalist, Ulrika Meinhof, who was involved in breaking him out. So they called him the Bader-Meinhof gang. And the folks involved hated the name, but it's a name that they could never shake. Like to this day, the movie came out a few years ago. It was called the Bader-Meinhof Complex and all of this. So, they write a letter to this radical left-wing newspaper in which, in very romantic terms, they explain that they'd just broken Andreas Bader out of, hi.
Sorry, brother.
That's okay. We just started kind of thing. So it's Ulrika Meinhof and some other folks have just broken Andreas Bader out of a library, essentially. Andreas Bader was this prisoner in West Berlin, and it's 1970, and this journalist Ulrika Meinhof and some other people have managed to spring him. He was at a library. And they write a letter to this radical left-wing newspaper in which they say in very romantic terms, grandiose terms, about how they'd freed Andreas Bader and how, what their politics are like, again, in very flowery, romantic kind of language, and then they end off with a call to build a Red Army and everything. So it's very exciting, but essentially what they follow this up by is kind of just a stepped up version of what they were doing before Andreas Bader had been arrested, which is sleeping on people's couches or, getting people to lend them their bed and talking to people about how we need to fight against the state and all of this. And they steal, they're a kind of larger group now, and some people, are stealing cars in order to get around. They go out of the country again, this time to the Middle East. This Palestinian group, the PLO, has a training camp in Jordan where they allow these West German, pretty much hippies to, go and shoot some guns and things. And then they travel back to West Berlin and, it's, they rob some banks to get some money. During this period, some of them are caught trying to steal cars. So, some people end up in prison. There's some close calls while robbing banks and things. There's some firefights. A young woman who's a part of their group is killed. A couple of police are killed. Then in 1971, they do their first big intervention. And what this intervention is they release a document. It's an essay. It's called The Urban Guerrilla Concept. It's the first document, I think, in which they use the word the name Red Army faction to describe themselves. And essentially what it is it's an open letter to the radical left, in which they explain what it is that they think they're doing, and they explain why they think other people should be doing the same kind of thing. And they also kind of give an evaluation of what other folks who came out of the student movement or the movement against the war in Vietnam, where they're at by 1971. So, I mean, in a nutshell, what they say is that all kinds of folks who say they want a revolution say that eventually this will require some kind of armed struggle, some armed component. But almost everyone says, not now, the time is right now. And what they say in the urban guerrilla concept is normally when you know that eventually you're going to have to do something, you don't wait until that moment to start doing it, because then you won't really know how to do it. And they kind of imply also that this is particularly true in the case of armed struggle, because it's not only you who has to learn how to do it, the rest of the left, which isn't doing this, have to get used to it and learn how to relate to you doing it. So they actually say, no, you have to start it beforehand. And they also say, you can't know whether or not the time is right or not just by reading or just by talking to people. You actually have to try it. And it's only, the proof will be in the pudding. If it works, in that case, the time was right. If it doesn't work, the time wasn't right. They look around 1971, most of the student movement, most of the radical left of just a few years earlier, this protest movement had, by 1971, they kind of rallied to the system. Because the thing is, for decades after World War II, the government in West Germany had been a coalition government led by this right-wing political party, the Christian Democrats. And, at the beginning of the 70s, or maybe it was even 69, there was an election and it switched to, for the first time, a coalition government led by the Social Democrats. So it kind of seemed like the government had lurched to the left. And there were various reforms, and so a lot of student radicals decided that, well, maybe we can work within the system. So the RAF see this, and they think this is like a disastrous development, but they also look at the main thing that other people who didn't want to work within the system were doing in the early 70s, and that is they were founding all of these tiny communist political parties, which generally had China or Albania as their reference points. They were like, you can call them Marxist-Leninist or Maoist political parties, and there were a bunch of them, and they all had the idea that they'd somehow lead a working-class revolution in West Germany. And the RAF addressed these people really respectfully in this document. They call them the proletarian comrades or the proletarian organizations. But essentially what they say is that they don't think these groups are very serious, because, using the examples of this group Gauche Prolétarienne in France or the Black Panther Party in the United States, they say these were groups that threatened the government, or that the government felt threatened by, and the government managed to crush them through the repression, through setting people up, through, making things illegal, through violence, and these groups were crushed. And so what they say is, if any of these tiny little Maoist parties in West Germany ever actually did manage to threaten the government or make the government or ruling class feel, scared, well, the government knows what to do in that case, and if you haven't prepared a guerrilla, some kind of underground, some way of resisting, being banned or being wiped out, you're not gonna last. And what's more, they say, in West Germany, the question isn't having a communist revolution. They say that's just not in the cards. With the history of the 20th century, they say, some kind of fascism is far more likely. So you actually don't need a guerrilla to have a communist revolution and take power, because that's so unlikely. What you need a guerrilla for is to defend yourselves if the government basically, suspends elections, declares martial law, and just tries to wipe out the left. So, they release this, and people don't go out and get bombs and guns as a result, or join the guerrilla en masse or anything, but a lot of people actually think this is, these aren't just bozos who like to steal cars and rob banks kind of thing. They actually have some kind of politics. You don't have to agree with them, but there's a political idea there, and they kind of establish themselves, as a legitimate part of the radical left, which isn't to say everyone thinks they're right, but people think, they're comrades kind of thing. And they follow this up very much with a year of more of the same. Occasionally robbing banks, stealing cars, trying to avoid police. till finally in 1972, they're ready to go into action. And the form this takes is a bunch of bombings. They bomb 2 police stations in retaliation against killer cops. They plan to bomb in a car which belongs to a judge who was in charge of trials of some of their members who'd been arrested. Only it's not him who's driving the car when the bomb goes off, it's his wife, so she's seriously hurt. They plan to bomb in the offices of a right-wing newspaper chain called the Springer Press. It's kind of like a print media version of Fox News or something. It was really hated by the student movement. That's a very controversial bombing because a bunch of people who work for the newspaper are hurt when it goes off. And even people who approve of the idea of armed attacks feel it's really important that not just be people who work for companies doing bad things that are hurt. They feel that, those people, shouldn't be targets. But their other 2 bombings are actually popular to a certain extent. And that is to say, they bomb 2 US military bases. And people die in those bombings. It was foreseeable people would die in those bombings. It wasn't like an accident or a mistake. And in the context, in their communiques, they say this is in the context of the war in Vietnam. They compare that war to Auschwitz, to like genocide, to the Holocaust. And, it's very clear that as Germans, they feel, Germany is complicit in this kind of thing and that they had this particular like historical duty to oppose that. So, I said these last 2 bombings were popular, but most people in West Germany probably wanted to bring back the death penalty to deal with them if they were caught, kind of thing. Most people in West Germany didn't approve of this. The left, for the most part, didn't approve of it. Trade unions denounced them. The Communist Party denounces them. These little Maoist communist parties denounce them. But you do have a bunch of people who actually think, who approve of that kind of thing, who actually, see their politics reflected in these bombings, especially the ones against the military bases. And the RAF, they weren't aiming, remember, they didn't feel they'd be able to lead a mass movement or revolution in West Germany. They were aiming at building a minority current. And when you're aiming at building a minority revolutionary or a minority resistance current, the mathematics is all different. It's like normally if I'd say you alienated 10,000 people, you inspired 200 people, like you'd think, well, that's a failure, right? Because you're alienating so many more people than you're, inspiring. But the thing is, there's already millions of people who hate you. That 10,000 people, it's really irrelevant kind of thing. Whereas, because what's another 10,000, But those few hundred people you've inspired, you've potentially doubled or tripled the number of people, who are down with your politics. So it's, they don't use exactly that formulation, but I think their history in the 1970s actually shows, and they use similar formulations, and it shows that kind of logic worked for them in the 70s. And we can see this because, like, these bombings, they're called the May Offensive. They're not called the Summer Offensive or the Spring Offensive, even though they had other stuff planned for June, because most of them are arrested really quickly. It's like police seal off neighborhoods, they go like door to door, they set up roadblocks all over the place, they really lock down West Germany and West Berlin. And not everyone in the RAF, but most people in the RAF are arrested over the next few weeks. And one thing that I say again and again when I give this talk is guerrilla organizations use bombs, they use guns, they use these military means, but they're not primarily military organizations. They're primarily political organizations, and they're a unique kind of political organization, but they really have to be understood that way. So whether or not a bombing works or an assassination works or something like that is in a sense secondary to the political consequences, whether or not the people they're trying to reach understand and approve of their action, or, even whether or not they force the state to, act the way that they want the state to act. So we can see this in that 1972, even though most of them are arrested, is just the beginning of their story. It's not the end. Also, from the state's point of view, even like the most vicious military dictatorship doesn't maintain power by keeping a gun at everybody's head 24/7. Like most of the time, the state maintains power through political, not military means. And so when the West German government had these people in prison, it, you know, that was a military victory for it, perhaps, but it wanted a political victory. It wanted these people to recant. It wanted these people to say, I'm sorry. Or if they wouldn't say, I'm sorry, it wanted them to appear in a really unfavorable light. Preferably as like deranged lunatics kind of thing. And it used a bunch of things to try and do this, but one of them, which really emerged as central in the RAF's history, is also one that's also really weird for me to talk about in the United States, because it's so widespread here today, but they started experimenting with the systematic use of solitary confinement. So, today, like, as I'm sure many of you know, like in the US, any given day there's 100,000 people in solitary confinement. And some of them have been there for years, some of them have been there for decades. It's like on a scale never before known in human history. And solitary confinement existed for ages, but, historically it was often just something that, a sadistic warden or a sadistic prison official would use, or something would be done just to, punish someone with solitary, but wasn't used generally in a systematic way to try and get people to renounce their beliefs. And what you see in the early 70s is you see the West German governments, one of the first governments that start experimenting and studying, can we get people to renounce their beliefs by using solitary confinement? And, the RAF prisoners are kind of unwilling guinea pigs in this experiment. So what this can mean is, it can mean, what you'd imagine it means, you're alone in a cell. In some cases, you're alone in a cell and they empty the cells around you. And in the most extreme cases, which is what happened to this woman, Astrid Prohl, and then after her to Ulrike Meinhof, they emptied out an entire wing of a prison. So one after another, each of these women was alone in a prison wing. And, they painted Ulrike Meinhof's cell white. They left the lights on 24/7, which again is super common today in supermaxes in the United States, but was at the time, a part of why it's common is they studied it and they realized this is a way of really bothering people, kind of thing. So, Meinhof was in these conditions for almost a year, and she thought she might be going crazy at the end of the year. But, it wasn't just her, and fairly quickly, the RAF prisoners realized that they're being targeted. Like, their lawyers visit them and they say it's not just you, it's the other people in your group also. You all have these weird conditions, kind of thing. And so the RAF prisoners decide, to do something about it. So the first thing, the first sign this takes publicly is they go on hunger strike in 1972. And after a few weeks, the state kind of agrees to review something, and they end their hunger strike, and the state says, well, we only kind of agreed to think about reviewing things, we're not actually changing anything, so yeah. So nothing really changes. So they go back on hunger strike in 1973. Pretty much same deal, the vague government promises kind of thing. Maybe one or two people have their conditions improved, but by and large, most of them are still in solitary. But these hunger strikes, they weren't failures for all that, because during these hunger strikes, the RAF prisoners are reaching out to people on the outside. It's like a hunger strike's a good way to get people speaking about you, speaking about why you're in prison, and they start having people who support them as political prisoners, and they're really rude to these people often. Like, they're not saying, oh, thank you for helping us fight against solitary confinement. They're saying, if you're only against solitary confinement, if you're only against torture in prison, you're a liberal. You're like a bourgeois humanitarian kind of thing. We don't want your support. Yeah, not polite. They're saying, we have politics beyond that, and we actually want people who support all of our politics. And they publicly denounce some political prisoner support groups for just being against torture or whatnot. It's not nice, and it's not necessarily, but wasn't necessarily meant as part of a conscious process, but definitely does have a result. And you see that result in 1974, because in 1974 they go on hunger strike again. And after a few weeks, this RAF prisoner, Holger Meins, was super well known in the student movement before he joined the RAF, he dies. He'd been force-fed for weeks, but they weren't giving him enough nutrition. This weird police unit called the Bond Security Group, which was in charge, amongst other things, of like political prisoners and things like that, they refused to allow him to be transferred to a hospital. So he dies in prison, and suddenly the support scene on the outside, explodes. Like, the moment the word hits the street that prisoners died, people start putting together Molotov cocktails and going out to riot, kind of thing. The next day, this other group tries to kidnap a judge in West Berlin. The judge resists. They kill him. There's little attacks here and there throughout Western Europe against West German targets. So, and in the context of all of this, some people who'd been doing political prisoner support work start dropping out of sight. And we know now what it is that they were planning. They basically felt prisoners died, we haven't been doing enough. We need to, renew this project, the Red Army faction, to try and get prisoners out. The first sign of this comes months later. So in February 1975, the strike's still going on, so people have been force-fed for months now. No one else has died, but they're not in great shape. And then a letter appears, signed by this group everyone thought didn't exist anymore, the Red Army faction, and in kind of macho language, they say, we order our prisoners to start eating again, we're going to settle this with our weapons. The prisoners start eating, and what they mean by that becomes clear soon enough. A bunch of people travel from West Germany to Sweden, to the capital city of Stockholm. They go into the West German embassy, they take out guns, they take hostages. The cops come into the embassy, the cops are told to leave, they don't leave, so the RAF, because it's the RAF doing this, they take the military affairs attaché and they shoot him through the head. So the cops leave at that point. At that point, they say, we booby-trapped the embassy. If anyone tries to come in, it's got to blow up. And they demand that the RAF prisoners in West Germany be released to whatever country will take them. So there's hours of negotiations. Late that night, they feel things aren't going anywhere, so they take the economic affairs attaché and they kill him. At which point they release the secretaries. So they're only holding diplomats, and at that point it's unclear what happened. We know West Germany flew in special police units, basically the equivalent of SWAT units. The RAF would say that the cops tried to enter the embassy. The cops would always say the RAF just didn't know what they were doing when they laid their explosives, but the thing is, the embassy exploded. Miraculously, only one person, a RAF member, was killed in the explosion. But all of the other RAF members are caught, and one other RAF member, this guy Siegfried Hausner, he has burns over most of his body, he has a fractured skull. Despite this, him and the other RAF people, they're flown from Sweden, from hospital, their hospital rooms in Sweden, to prisons in West Germany. And Siegfried Hausner dies, in Stammheim prison a few days later. He needed to be in an ICU. Not in a prison, sick bay. And, when I heard about this action, I thought it was a really horrible action. For one, I don't like the idea of shooting people through the head. For two, the goal is to get people out of prison, and it just seemed, by that standard, it was a failure. No one's out of prison. More people are in prison, plus, two people on your side, like on the RAF side, are dead. I just couldn't understand why they didn't either stop then or just stop trying to get people out of prison with these actions then, kind of thing, because it just seemed a real failure. But one thing I learned while doing these books, or that I think I learned, is that when I have a reaction like that, it's not so much about me, as it is about just, my context, kind of thing. In a different context, I might feel differently. Because, in West Germany at the time, a lot of people actually felt differently about this action. It wasn't seen as a failure. Like the RAF prisoners who they were trying to free kind of felt, they felt two things. On the one hand, they felt you've really unmasked the supposedly left-wing social democratic government of West Germany. You've shown that they were, willing to send in the cops and, risk everyone dying rather than free political prisoners. And they also felt, really moved and encouraged by the fact that people who in many cases they hadn't known personally beforehand were willing to risk their lives, willing to give their lives even to get them out of prison. So it really broke through this sense of isolation that the government had been trying to build up around them. At the same time, it's not only true in Western, I think in every society at every time you have lots of people who are living in a legal gray zone. It's like they're not at war against the state, but they're also, not obeying the law in their day-to-day life kind of thing. And one thing that was special about the radical left in those days, not just in West Germany, but also in West Germany, is there were lots of people on the radical left living in that legal gray zone. And a lot of those people at that time, in 1975, they looked at Stockholm and their reaction was to think, wow, like less than a dozen people managed that. It seems like they were only planning it for a few months. Imagine the possibilities kind of thing. If there were more of us, if we thought more about it. So for a lot of people, it actually either opens the door or keeps open the door to the idea of this kind of armed activity. And specifically in terms of freeing prisoners. Whether they'd have done anything or not, if things had just stayed at that point, impossible to say, because this entire story in the 1970s is a story of one thing after another, pushing things forward. It's like an overdetermined story in a sense, because the next thing that happens is in 1976. It's 4 years after most of the RAF people had been arrested. And finally, the so-called ringleaders have a trial. And they're considered too dangerous to be allowed to have a trial in a courthouse. There's a special building built on the prison grounds for them. And it's a crazy trial by West German standards. They pass a whole bunch of new laws just for this trial, amongst which suddenly barring lawyers from defending more than one defendant on similar charges related to terrorism kind of things. So, you have prisoners who suddenly, they don't have a lawyer. It gets revealed close to the end of this trial that one of the judges is leaking confidential court documents to the Springer Press, to the same right-wing newspaper chain which had been bombed. And so, it's again, when we were researching the first volume, the issue of the Sunday Times, I think, this British news magazine, their title for the trial was Show Trial. So, it was an exceptional trial, and the prisoners were putting forward kind of a standard political prisoner defense, which they weren't saying they didn't do it. They were kind of saying why they felt justified to have done it. They were saying, West Germany's an illegitimate government, set up by the United States after World War II, complicit with U.S. war crimes around the world, CIA involved in domestic politics, the whole shebang kind of thing. And if you remember, Ulrike Meinhof had been a journalist, and she'd also been politically active on the left for years, so she actually knew some people who are now in the Social Democratic government and everything. So she was really well placed, and she apparently was really intrinsic to working on this defense. And then just at the point that the prisoners would later say this defense was going to reach its, its conclusion and everything was going to come to a head, it's announced that Ulrike Meinhof won't be showing up in court anymore because she was found dead in her prison cell. So according to the state, and there's this entire psychobabble explanation that exists now that she killed herself on Mother's Day because she felt guilty about her twin daughters being raised by her sleazeball ex because she'd become a revolutionary guerrilla. But that's kind of the state story. At the time, everyone on the radical left felt she'd been killed. And it's not proof that she was killed, but the state really added to this perception just by acting super arrogantly, by insisting that their doctor do the autopsy before the family's doctor, and then, certain tissues just weren't there anymore for the family's doctor, insisting that her lawyer or family members not be allowed into the cell where she allegedly hanged herself until, after they'd taken everything out and even repainted it. So it's folks think there's a cover-up. Even folks who don't like the RAF, like Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir in France, write this public letter saying, we think she was killed, we think there's a cover-up, and all of this. And some of those people who, had looked at Stockholm and thought, well, maybe we can do better, they're like, wow, geez, a prisoner's dead because we didn't do better. It's like, we have to do something or the prisoners are all going to be killed. So they start making concrete plans. And in 1977, finally, they're ready to go into action. And the form this takes is a series of, bloody attacks against the state to pressure the state to release prisoners or improve their conditions. So the first thing is the Attorney General of West Germany. This guy, Siegfried Buback, former member of the Nazi SS, which wasn't really unusual for government officials at the time. He was held responsible by the RAF and by a lot of the left for prison conditions, for the deaths in prison of Holger Meins and Siegfried Hausner and Ulrike Meinhof. He's waiting at a traffic light. Motorcycle drives up beside his car. They take out a submachine gun. They riddle the car with bullets. His chauffeur is dead. His bodyguard's dead. He's dead. Second RAF action, they try to kidnap a banker. This guy, Jürgen Ponto, he resists. He's shot dead. Next, they try to attack the offices of the next Attorney General. They rig a homemade missile launcher with a timing device. They aim it at his offices, but the timing device fails, so that doesn't work. But their next attack, at least initially, does work, and that is they ambush, killing the police escort, killing his bodyguards and chauffeur. They ambush and kidnap the most powerful businessman in West Germany at the time. This guy, Hans Martin Schleyer, was his name. In World War II, he'd been a mid to high level official in the Nazi SS. He'd been in charge of Germanizing the economy of what in 1977 was Czechoslovakia. He was a part of the state. He wasn't elected, but he was more powerful than most politicians. He was, after the war, his Nazi past was forgiven. He was allowed to have a nice career, and by 1977 he was president of the Employers Association, president of the Industrialists Association. He was on TV or in the newspapers every week, representing the business community, and now the RAF had him. And in a document, a tiny little letter basically that they leave at the site of this massacre, where they grabbed him, they basically say they want their prisoners released again to whatever country will take them, and that they also don't want the cops to try and find them or they'll kill Schleyer. Suddenly there's police with submachine guns on almost every street corner. There's barbed wire going up around government buildings. There's tanks going down the streets in West Germany. And normally the West German government takes months to pass new legislation. In a few days they pass a law called the Contact Ban Law, which targets political prisoners like the RAF prisoners. Suddenly the RAF prisoners, with this Contact Ban Law, they're not allowed any visits with anyone, including lawyers. They're not allowed access to radio, television, newspaper. The idea is they're in 100% isolation, no contact with anyone except guards or, occasionally government representatives who go and visit them and say, what are we got to do about this horrible hostage taking? It's referred to in lots of accounts as a counter-kidnapping by the state because no one could, speak to or even find out what conditions the prisoners were in anymore. The RAF had said, don't look for us or we're going to kill them, but the state is looking for them. It's suddenly everyone on the radical left is being, tailed by cops, 24/7. And, the idea was maybe people would lead them to the RAF, which isn't the case because the RAF has no contact with anyone, during this period. But they're also looking for the RAF, and they catch some people during this period. And, the RAF had said, we're going to kill him if you do this, but the RAF doesn't kill him because, he's all they have in a sense. They need Schleyer in the hopes that prisoners will be released. Everyone I've spoken to who was active in the radical left at the time in West Germany remembers this as a nightmare. It's the entire society seemed de facto martial law. Everyone expected there to be like an official suspension of like bourgeois democracy, and Germany would revert to being a dictatorship. Everyone expected everyone to be rounded up at any moment. It was a terrifying time, and no one really felt capable of, dealing with the situation. And, for the RAF too, they'd said, free our prisoners quickly, or we kill Schleyer. But, we end our first volume with, this 1977 offensive. Like, they released, it must be, close to a dozen communiques over a period of weeks. And by the end of it, it's desperate kind of thing. It's, you can tell they're like, it's practically like, why don't you believe that we'll kill him kind of thing, release our prisoners or else. But it's like, it's been weeks of you guys saying this, the government's kind of calling your bluff. And so what they do in this situation, where things aren't working out as they hoped, is they reach out to some other people for help. They reach out to a group based in the Middle East called the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine External Operations. And it really pissed us off during the first volume. All of the accounts we could read in English referred to this as the PFLP, which it's not. The PFLP, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, is a very large organization, which at the time was led by this guy, George Habash. Tons of support amongst the Palestinian population. The PFLP-EO was a tiny group which left the PFLP in the early 70s because the EO part, the external operations, they did stuff outside of the Middle East, which Habash's PFLP had a ban on. And because the PFLP-EO did stuff outside of the Middle East, they had contact with groups like the RAF, which, were active outside of the Middle East. So it's to them that the RAF go in 77 saying, can you help us? Because, we're in a jam. And the PFLP-EO, they turn around and they give some options, and the RAF picks one. And the one they pick is that an airplane, like not full of people who were in the Nazi SS or bankers or politicians or whatever, but full of regular folks on their way home from a vacation on this, Mediterranean island of Mallorca. This plane gets hijacked and it gets diverted to the Middle East, and from the Middle East to the capital city of Somalia, Mogadishu. The PFLP-EO guerrillas who'd hijacked it, they say, we want 2 of our prisoners in Turkey released, and we want the RAF prisoners released. This is an action in solidarity with the RAF. Do this or the hostages die.
Oh my God.
Yeah, it's like everyone on the radical left beforehand was like living in a nightmare kind of thing in West Germany, and suddenly it's gotten so much worse. It's like people just don't know what to do. It's like all of the oxygen got sucked out of the world kind of thing. It's like, and the one player who knows what to do is the government. The government sends its special anti-terrorist unit, GSG-9, to Mogadishu, and GSG-9 in the middle of the night raid the airplane. And, they kill 3 of the 4 guerrillas, they capture the 4th. And to this day, in like counterinsurgency schools and counterinsurgency manuals, the Mogadishu rescue is like the model rescue, because the hostages were traumatized, but none of them were killed. The pilot had been killed previously, but in the raid by GSG-9, none of the hostages are killed. The government the next day, the next morning, press conference, it's what you'd expect. We have won, the evil terrorists have lost kind of thing, the hostages are safe. And then almost as an afterthought, they're like, those, paraphrasing here, but those other evil terrorists, the RAF prisoners, all of this fuss is because of them. Well, last night the ringleaders decided to commit suicide. So, according to the government, in Stammheim prison, which was the most high-security prison in Western Europe, Andreas Bader and Jan Karl Rasp had managed to get guns. Months earlier, smuggled in by lawyers. And they'd hidden those guns, according to the government, for months, even though their cells were searched, and even though they were switched from one cell to another. And on the night in question, they shot themselves through the head, and Gudrun Ensslin hanged herself. And remember, they're not supposed to have access to media. So, it begs the question, how did they know that they weren't about to be released? How did they know that there had been a hostage taking of this airplane and that hadn't worked out? So according to the government, Jan Karl Rasp not only had hidden a gun for months, he'd hidden tools he'd stolen in the prison months earlier before the contact ban went into place. And once the contact ban was there, he took out the tools and surreptitiously he built like a shortwave radio receiver and also a telegraph system so he could communicate with the other prisoners.
Could you say that again?
Jan Karl Rasp, one of the RAF supposed ringleaders kind of thing, which was a term they hated because they always said, we don't have leaders, we're all equals. But, one of these prisoners in Stammheim prison, months earlier, there'd been construction work being done at the prison. And the government story was he'd stolen tools, like screwdriver, hammer, saw, whatever kind of thing. And that he'd hidden these tools, and that once the contact ban was in place, he used these tools to open up the wall in his cell and take out wires, and he could make both a shortwave radio receiver and also some kind of like Morse code system or something like that to talk to the other prisoners. So
to go in on a joint pact of suicide.
Yeah, to make a suicide pact and to also find out what was happening with this airplane hijacking. It sounds unbelievable, and it sounds more unbelievable with what I'm about to tell you next. The government then says, our cameras in that floor of the prison malfunctioned that night. And the cherry on the cake, if you will, is there's a fourth RAF prisoner on that floor of the prison, this woman, Irmgard Moiler. The government says that she smuggled a knife from her food tray, that she kept it. And you'd imagine in a high-security prison, this isn't going to be the sharpest knife in the world, but nevertheless, that night she apparently stabs herself repeatedly through the chest with this knife. But the thing is, she doesn't die. So a few days later, she comes to in a hospital, and she has her lawyer release a statement saying, I wasn't aware of any suicide pact, I didn't try and kill myself, I was attacked, I believe it was some kind of government death squad or something. You can understand the idea from the government's perspective. You're gonna mess up our entire society to, free your crazy prisoners. We'll just make sure you have no more prisoners left to free. Something I want to say, which I don't want to get into now. We can in the Q&A, though I can't really explain it even then. Is I've presented kind of like a case of how ridiculous this is. I've done that so that you can understand that everyone on the radical left at the time, again, feel these people had been killed and that there's a government cover-up. Today, we don't know anything that wasn't really known by 1978. The government story has always been lawyers smuggled in guns and all of this. And at the time, most people thought this was nuts. Even people on the right. I even read memoirs by people claiming to be former CIA agents in which they kind of say, yeah, we knew they killed the prisoners and all of this kind of thing. But, today, almost everyone, including people on the radical left, including even some former RAF people, say we actually believe they did commit suicide. So it's just this massive shift.
Thanks to that film, too. I think that perpetuates.
Yeah, thanks in part to the film, and there were other films in Germany, and thanks in part to just, I think, it's just the nature of, consciousness. What you think is possible changes in time. And, it's we... working on these books, we've had contact with former political prisoners who say, we think they committed suicide. We actually do think they were that good. And there's kind of also a theory which is floated, which I think a lot of people rally to, not because it necessarily is true, but just because it's emotionally satisfying, which is that the government facilitated them committing suicides. The government found out that there was an idea of a suicide pact ahead of time and said, well, actually, we're willing to let them smuggle in guns and everything if they're just going to kill themselves with them. So this is kind of like the theory that Stefan Aust, whose book the film is based on, that he says he believes. But there's no proof of this.
Were the lawyers ever charged, and did they ever have any evidence that could have actually happened?
Lawyers were charged, and legal assistants were charged. And one of the things is there's a history of legal assistants joining the RAF. So there's a history of legal assistants, because you can see why. There's also a history of people supporting political prisoners becoming legal assistants, kind of thing. There's one lawyer who joined the RAF, but other than that, no. And lawyers did do jail time around this, and also simply around defending the RAF. Lawyers would do jail time. Same way that Lynn Stewart kind of thing here. 2 legal assistants or former legal assistants testify that they smuggled in, they say, we personally smuggled in these weapons. And the thing you have to understand is it doesn't mean that they're lying, but they were facing, years in prison for supporting a terrorist organization. And because of their testimony, they basically don't get any prison time. They get new identities, and they get, in one case at least, they get like cash from the government to relocate. So it doesn't mean they're lying. Maybe they smuggled in the weapons, but it's kind of like the testimony. It casts some doubt over the testimony because they certainly, it was in their self-interest. In one case, in one case, the government was also threatening, to take their kid away and all. So it's not clear cut, and I can't say what happened one way or another. It's but whichever way it happened, the prisoners were dead. That much, is incontrovertible, and that was a disaster for the RAF. And that was a disaster for the radical left, and that was a disaster for the other RAF prisoners, because there's still lots of other RAF prisoners who didn't commit suicide or get killed that night. And a bigger catastrophe is that, becomes clear very soon, which is that a lot of people who'd approved of the RAF really didn't approve of this idea of hijacking airplanes. And, when the RAF prisoners have their funeral, some people, tons of people go to their funeral, and some people go with a banner which basically says, "We denounce deaths in prison. We denounce hijacking airplanes." For years, the kind of sexist cliche that people defending armed struggle would put forward is, the little old lady selling flowers on the street corner has nothing to fear from the guerrilla. But obviously, if she was on her way home from Mallorca that day, she had something to fear from the guerrilla. So, this does a lot of damage on a political level to the RAF, and it probably becomes even harder for the RAF folks at large kind of thing. They kill Schleyer once it's announced the prisoners are dead. But it's really hard for them. There's a letter smuggled out from another RAF prisoner to them, in which this RAF prisoner is saying, "We discussed hijacking airplanes, and we decided we didn't do that kind of thing. We disapproved of that kind of action." The prisoners who just, died in prison had decided that they disapproved of that kind of action. You've really messed things up by doing this. So it's hard for them. And, it's hard for them also in a practical way. The cops are out to get them. The cops make it really clear they're happy to not take prisoners. It's there are RAF people who are killed who have no gun on them, over the next 2 years. That's okay. There's a RAF member who opens the door to a safe house, and the cops are waiting. They just shoot him through the head. You know what I mean? It's miraculously he survives, though with massive amounts of damage. But then he's in prison. So it's a hard time. It'll be 2 years before the RAF try another armed action, and it'll be 4 years before they actually manage anything that works. And